Good morning. Not too long ago, I was talking on a live stream about how I have been thinking of doing more scientifically oriented tangent ramblings, but one of the first limitations I put on myself when starting this channel was that I wanted to keep science things within the realm of textiles, textile industry and fibers, even though that is not what my PhD focused on at all. Because niching down and other stuff like that. Well, as is often to be expected from these things, there was lots and lots of enabling going on in the comments, so I want to talk to you today about the cocktail effect. The cocktail effect is simultaneously one of my favorite and least favorite concepts all at the same time. Favorite because the individual pieces that come together to make up the cocktail effect are in a way really satisfying because they all make so much sense and the pieces all come together really well. Least favorite because while it makes excellent sense as to why things would work like that, it is also devastating, not just for the consequences it is having, but because it is also infuriatingly difficult to study at the scales that would be necessary for the sheer amounts of chemical pollutants that have gotten released into the environment by now. Are you ready for this? So, the cocktail effect was a concept I was first introduced to from a pharmacology class. At its core, it deals with how, when you take different medications at the same time, they can perform differently than we might expect based on how the medications perform when they are studied or taken one at a time. The basic assumption, until proven otherwise, would be that two drugs would have additive effects. 1 + 1 is 2, such as paracetamol and ibuprofen working together to provide better pain relief. Another alternative, though, would be what we call antagonistic effects, or 1 + 1 is less than 2, with one medication suppressing the effect of the other. This is why several mental health drugs warn against consuming grapefruit, or why one blood pressure medication requires the doctor to know that when they prescribe it, they must also double the birth control dosage at the same time if the patient is using both. But where there are negative effects, we can also have the chance of positive or synergistic effects. So 1 + 1 is more than 2. Common examples include alcohol and antidepressants, which can relax the body to the point where it becomes dangerous, and to a much larger extent than you would expect from studying or taking each of these drugs on their own. This is because bodies are really complex systems, and the response to any external influence is almost never one-to-one. Worth mentioning, but not quite the same, is active coal, which has been used for a long time in helping absorb poison that has been swallowed, and has lately been growing in popularity as a food additive because it is one of few ingredients that can dye food black. The reason it is helpful in absorbing some of the poison if you swallow any is that active coal is exceptionally porous. It is just covered in holes and has a really large surface area comparative to its size. So molecules get trapped inside and struggle to get back out again until the active coal is excreted. But just like the body does not know the difference between drugs, vitamins, or poison, they are all just external chemicals to deal with to keep our body healthy, active coal is similarly not able to distinguish between poison, vitamins, and medication. So you may want to think twice before overindulging on lots and lots of black-colored foods in a short amount of time, especially if you are also dependent on regular medication. But back to the cocktail effect, which is just the name pharmacology came up with for this. Various drug combinations can have unknown total effects in the body phenomenon. And what is true for drugs in pharmacology is often also true for environmental pollutants in the body of humans or other organisms as well. There is a reason why our introductory course was called Introduction to Pharmacology and Toxicology, because the pathways are often similar, but it is the effects that differ. Plus, the whole thing about the only thing separating poison and medicine is very often just a matter of dosage. And this is where my gripe with the cocktail effect comes in. Or rather, it is a perfect storm of various systems all pointing at each other while trying to tell us that they are not the source of the problem. There are many different pollutants in the environment. I primarily worked with something called persistent organic pollutants, so I'll mainly stick with those, but there are other groups as well, such as inorganic pollutants and incidents such as the methyl mercury tragedy in Minamata Bay in Japan. But while there are many different pollutants that we and other creatures on this planet are surrounded by and exposed to every day, the chemicals themselves are generally tested for safety and safe release levels one at a time. This is because multi-pollutant studies are really, really expensive and complex. I think the most I've seen is 3, maybe 5, but no more. So if you know of any, please do send them my way. In a world where publish or perish stands so strongly in academia and the number of articles published reigns supreme as the metric academic researchers are judged by, you really cannot afford to run long, complex and expensive studies if you only expect to get one article from it, even if it is a really revolutionary article. To be competitive, cynically speaking, you would want as many potential articles as possible from the least amount of time and money. And multi-chemical exposure studies grow really big and really expensive really fast. I don't know the national standards off the top of my head, but for a single chemical exposure study, say you want 5 or 10 fish or other organisms to make sure your results are not just an anomaly in a single organism. Let's say 5, just to keep it on the lower end of things. You will want an exposure tank and a clean, unexposed tank to act as a reference. You would want different concentrations of exposure too, but let us just keep it really, really bare bones and ignore that detail. So for a single chemical, you need at least 2 experiments, drug and no drug. For 2 chemicals, you will need a tank for drug A alone, drug B alone, drug A and B combined, and an unexposed blank tank. So 4 in total. For 3 chemicals, you'll need a tank for each for drug A, B, and C by themselves, and all combinations of the 3 plus your blank. It isn't looking too bad yet. We're only looking at like 8 experiments. This is still manageable. But by 4 chemicals, we are at 16 experiments if my good old matrix math is correct. By 5, we are up to 32 separate experiments, which would make sense because the previous ones have all been multiplicative by 2. And you do not need to be a math whiz to see that this will start to add up really quickly. And if we remember that we were talking about at the very least a minimum of 5 fish per a sample group, which really is a very small number for an exposure study like this, we are already talking at least 160 fish for a study of just 5 chemicals. To put that into perspective, in my work alone, we developed methods for analyzing over 70 different human-made chemicals that have been detected in the environment. Imagine if we had to design a study to look at the various cross-interactions between all of those. It would be insanely expensive. So when chemicals are studied for their safe exposure levels in the environment, we study them one at a time. And when those exposure levels are set, they are set based on results from organisms living in otherwise clean environments, save for that singular chemical. But us, as humans or organisms living in the wild, are not living in clean environments. We are already exposed to hundreds of other chemicals in tiny, tiny doses. And just like the expression, death by 1,000 cuts, it is not hard to imagine that an immune system already battling many different things in small amounts may just not have the same response as an immune system battling only one threat. Said differently, and back to the cocktail effect, even if none of the pollutants were similar and acted on similar pathways in the body, which is not true, but hey, and we only assume the oversimplified and inaccurate 1 + 1 = 2 model of drug interaction, we could still sum up our exposure to many different chemicals and end up over the safe threshold of these chemicals having a negative effect on the body. This can look like breathing in flame retardants coming from various home electronics and textiles in the morning, handling a couple of receipts coated in bisphenol A or bisphenol S on your way to work, eating a tiny amount of phthalates from plastic packaging around your lunch, breathing in small amounts of PFAS from your raincoat on your way home, and let's just add in some exhaust fumes because most of us live in cities with a decent amount of traffic while we are at it. At the end of the day, your immune system may have handled 2 or 3 of those exposures perfectly well, but stacked on top of each other, they may cause issues like heightened chemical sensitivity or chronic illnesses. But you cannot blame any single exposure on the whole picture. So in our legislative and single business focused world, whose fault is it? And studying the whole picture is, as I sketched out, really expensive, really time-consuming, and really complex. I haven't even gotten into the complexities of multivariate analysis, which everyone loves to do these days because it is a buzzword and you get so much data, but then at the end you get so much data, and how do you handle it and analyze it and treat it all properly to get results and outcomes that make sense. A forest full of data is an awful lot of data that could tell us a whole lot of different things, but how can we tell for sure what is influencing each other and how when there are so many potential effects and sources? So we get case studies instead, such as scientists observing that fertility in polar bears is declining, but polar bears experience many stressors these days, particularly with the loss of ice caps and food sources. So we can only, speculate that part of it may be due to the high levels of environmental pollutants that we find in their bodies and particularly their livers. A similar story can be found with a pod of orcas off the coast of the UK. Due to their matriarchal passing of knowledge, each orca pod around the world has subtly different hunting and movement behavior. But this pod has not reproduced in many, many years and is likely to be lost entirely with time if nothing changes. Again, we can only speculate that this might be due to the high total combination of pollutants we are detecting in their samples, but because the environment of wild organisms is so complex, we cannot scientifically say anything conclusive without controlled studies in controlled environments. Nothing that can be taken into regulatory practices anyway. Because a lot of chemicals are used with the assumption that they do no harm, or that they break down before they cause too much harm, or that they have been in use for so long that we cannot just, remove them from production on suspicion alone. Industry depends on it after all. So it is up to scientists to prove that a chemical is detectable in nature and that it is causing harm at the current levels it is being found in nature at, often in studies that span decades. All the while, industry is continuing business as usual while these studies are taking place, regardless of the levels of similar chemicals that may have similar effects and work on similar biological pathways. In theory, there is supposed to be a precautionary principle at play, but realistically that just doesn't happen. And even when testing is being implemented for a new chemical before it gets introduced to the market, it is usually only required at the intended site of action. So for instance, for a medical drug, we are looking at extensive human trials before it can be released as a new medication on the market. But the body does not metabolize and use 100% of the drug when we swallow a pill. Often it is much, much less. A lot of the medication just gets peed out again and end up in our wastewater treatment plants, which are not at all equipped to deal with chemicals dissolved in the water. They are mostly just equipped to deal with the solids that come along with the wastewater. And then it goes out to sea where it has unmeasured and untested effects on the local aquatic populations because, again, they weren't part of the target group for the drug, so it's not going to have an effect on them, right? And that is how we discovered after the fact that estrogen in birth control pills were also causing a collapse of fish population because it was having a similar birth control effect on the fish. And while we are on the topic of not so much precautionary principle, a lot of the times when a chemical is actually banned, the industry looks for a substitute. You know, something with similar physical and chemical properties, because they need it for industrial purpose reasons. A lot of the time, they end up with a different chemical from the same family that perhaps was slightly more expensive to produce or had a slightly lower yield, which was why it wasn't chosen the first time around. The lack of industrial use previously means these substitute chemicals often have little to no exposure data when they are, putting into production. But no data does not mean a chemical is safe. It just means no data. And so the cat and mouse hunt begins anew for both the environmental chemist and the health and safety representative at the factory. And since it was chosen due to similar physical and chemical properties, it is not unusual that it has similar detrimental effects in nature either. And as a final piece to this shitstorm puzzle, not only does legislation get written after we have discovered the harm a chemical has been doing for decades, but in order to restrict any specific chemical, you need to prove without a shadow of a doubt that it is that specific chemical causing the issue, at the specific level that it is being detected in nature at or lower. If you try to talk about how the cocktail of chemicals at low levels actually observed in nature are having a detrimental effect on our planet, the industry players just shrug their shoulders and continue as normal because that is what everyone else is doing, and you can't prove that it is their specific chemical doing the harm. Maybe point some fingers at each other and launch some bias studies showing that their stuff is safe, such as using less than ideal instruments for measuring the thing they want to measure, which takes an expert in the methods at hand to spot and point out the issues of. I stumbled upon one of these biased studies during the research for the machine washable wool video. It was on a microscopy method, and I worked with chromatography, so I sent it to a friend who does microscopy, and they instantly spotted why the method they had chosen was not suitable for what they were actually trying to measure. Something I could not see because, much as I am an expert in the methods we used in my research group, I am still very much a layperson when it comes to many other analytical methods. So chemicals are brought from discovery to production way before we have any idea of their total life cycle behavior in the environment, because industry needs to make back the money they invested in their development. And then, when there may be issues related to that, they demand proof that it is explicitly their chemical creating issues, when the real world, in all its complexity, does not work like that at all. So in a way, everyone is responsible, and yet no one can be held accountable. Are you depressed yet? Because we have known about this for a while, and This is one of the reasons I started to struggle with the whole story of, you will become a scientist and change the world then, narrative that I was being faced with, because once you get into the literature, you realize that none of this is news. We have known about these issues at varying levels of complexity and coverage around the world for decades already, and it is just so frustrating. Anyway, this was the first of potentially more science rants to come if this is something people find interesting. Increasingly, viewers are starting to ask about the work I actually did for my PhD, which is different from the science videos I have been doing thus far, so maybe we talk a bit about that. The danger of tangents on these subjects are high though, because it is all connected in one way or another. But that is all the rambling you are going to get this time around. I hope it was not too convoluted. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something new, whether you are new or old to environmental chemistry and all our adjacent specialty fields. If you wish to support more unhinged word vomits like these, the best way to do so is to head over to Patreon and become a supporter, or if that is not to your preference, my website has a small shop with a few digital patterns and some such sundry things. Links to both of those, along with some chosen references, in the description box below. Until next time, stay curious. Bye! Look at her. A very necessary, very snoozy palette cleanser here at the very end. Hello, please focus on me and my face again as we restart because we ran out of battery. Hey sweetie, I'm sorry your laugh vanished. And while we are on the topic of not so much words,